Hello everyone, today we talk about the Armada in the early months of 1588 from the Spanish side. Then we will continue with the English one in another video. We're going really step by step in this series that I started almost 2 years ago, because this is one of the most important campaigns in the history of warfare, and I think it really deserves this very specific attention. For any curiosity about the prodromes, so to say, you can check my 16th century history playlist at some point when the series is going to be finished. I will perhaps create, in fact, a playlist about the Armada. In itself, there's also the same content to be found in the naval warfare video, Renaissance navies, stuff like that. In any case, as Spain was intensifying her preparations for an invasion of England in the early months of 1588, a devastating blow struck, right? Not through an English raid that, as we've seen, had successfully delayed the Spanish preparations for the invasion to an extent, not quite enough to put England into safety, but still, but with the death of a pivotal leader. In fact, on February the 9th, 1588, Álvaro de Bazan, the Marquis de Santa Cruz, succumbed to old age and exhaustion amidst the frenetic preparations for the Armada itself. Santa Cruz's demise was catastrophic due to his unmatched reputation and expertise. A veteran naval commander, he was dynamic, fearless, and widely revered across Europe, by the way, for his strategic brilliance. At the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, he led the Spanish Reserve Squadron, which witnessed the deployment of 20 galleys to correct the tactical errors by Gian Andrea Doria, playing a critical role in the victory against the Ottoman fleet. His rapid maneuver at Lepanto, exploiting gaps in the Ottoman line, was really pivotal in breaking their formation. And at some point we will make a video about the Battle of Lepanto. We never made a video about Renaissance naval battles, but of course here we're warming up. In 1582, during the Battle of Ponta Delgada in the Azores, Santa Cruz employed aggressive boarding tactics using grapples and close quarters combat to rout a 60-ship Anglo-French privateer fleet supporting the Portuguese pretender Don Antonio, solidifying his status as a naval genius. Figures like these were really rare, and as we've seen, revered across the continent, also by his opponents, realizing the feats that such admiral, in this case, had managed to pull off in a time where, as we've seen, naval warfare was going under a specific phase of transformation, of experimentation, and so also the chances to prove the tactical, strategical intuitions connected with the development of navies, especially under probably a royal, so a national supervision, were not much rare per se, but required like very specific authority and competence to be carried out next to, in fact, really exceptional command capabilities. This is why, as the architect of the same Spanish modern navy, Santa Cruz had overseen the construction of its galleons. I also made a video about the age of galleons in general and explained a bit their structure, integrating, in this case, advanced shipbuilding techniques from Iberian and Italian yards, such as reinforced hulls and improved rigging. Santa Cruz had served as the chief administrator of this important military reform, ensuring meticulous logistical planning. So I meant that if you just have an idea of the sort of the complexity and also the comprehensive nature of the probably all the skills, all the vision the closeness to the technical dimension, to the engineers, to people that whose names we often don't know, but that had to be equally trusted as individuals. So all unusual qualities, but also conditions that had allowed Santa Cruz to gain unprecedented experience in the myriad of factors really necessary to successfully accomplish the affirmation of this oceanic scale of naval power by the side of Spain as equally the strongest, together with all her dependencies, country in Europe. This is why Santa Cruz's loss disrupted Spain's strategic momentum. It's as if his detailed invasion plans had been etched in his mind with a perspective, a vision, a concreteness, and in a control that could have not been really mastered by anyone. Besides, he had all a level of intelligence, of connections, of international relations that were really necessary to carry out the invasion of England. That could not simply rest on, in fact, like a naval expedition per se. For example, Santa Cruz had coordinated a rendezvous with the Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese, whose 30,000 strong army in the Netherlands would have had to back, in fact, the invasion of England had the Spanish completed. We've seen what Parma really thought about the invasion and also in which terms he thought it could be possible, and we will talk in the later episodes about his role, his take during the same campaign. So all these contacts, all these debates had basically been not useless, but they had left incomplete some of the most important parts of the work. Naturally, this is an ominous event. Imagine, again, you rely on this guy for this unprecedented feat in the history of warfare, and you have basically him dying just before, just as the expedition is about to start. Santa Cruz's personal rapport with the same King Philip II had secured significant royal funding, as we've seen also from Elizabeth's side in England, very often in spite of, again, of the chanted notion of the centralization of modern states, etc. Much of this system still worked thanks to the support of the crown's purse, and really an ad personam kind of understanding from the side of sovereigns to whom entrust these assets and for which broader political and strategical purpose, right? And this connection was cut short. In any case, Philip had allowed Santa Cruz to start the Spanish Navy's expansion, the staggering number of 100 new vessels made since 1570. Santa Cruz's absence left thus a leadership vacuum, to say the least, as no other commander matched his ability to unify Spain's diverse naval factions, as we were just saying from the decisional point of view. Also, in terms of actual forces being gathered, we've seen it in the previous videos. We talk Spain, but we're talking also Portugal, Naples, other powers that joined forces for the major Iberian crown to launch the offensive on England. King Philip II's decision to appoint Alonso Pérez de Guzman, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, as Santa Cruz's successor was equally catastrophic. Of course, we don't have to think that all in all these factors alone were the reason why the Armada failed, which is in fact something that happened just by a slight margin, so to say. Nevertheless, they did not help, and this from the other side, how close the Spanish went to succeed as well. At 37 years old in 1588, Medina Sidonia was Spain's wealthiest and most prominent noble, whose prestige commanded the loyalty of the contentious Spanish squadron commanders as well. This was a highly political rather than just strategical or operational matter. However, Medina Sidonia lacked the boldness, decisiveness, and naval experience required for such a critical role. This was also felt by the other commanders. During the Armada campaign, Medina Sidonia would falter at key moments, such as failing to exploit early English disarray of Plymouth, which we will see on July the 31st, 1588. We'll save it for the English side of the story. On that occasion, we will see how a rapid assault could have disrupted the English fleet's formation, so causing also the major shield of England there to falter. Aware of his shortcomings, Medina Sidonia had himself sought to decline the command of the Armada expedition, citing his lack of maritime expertise in a letter to Philip II, expressing concerns about his health and inexperience. So he was, in that sense, straightforward. His reliance on written instructions reveals this, as he was guided more by this sort of by-the-book, step-by-step command than an instinctive naval judgment, such as the one displayed by Santa Cruz, which would end up hindering his command. This is particularly important because, again, these men would be responsible ultimately for the whole thing in practice. Like, of course, the sovereigns would get like the greatest burden of all in case of defeat. But as we've seen also from the English side, if the leaders you entrust, in that case the defense of your fatherland, hadn't been particularly bold and able to risk a lot, like you could have not really fully exploited the Clausewitz in Trinity, so to say, when properly reflecting in the course of operations, especially, as von Clausewitz says, in the case of the offensive. In other words, like especially the offensive is the moment in which all the elements of the Trinity must be at the strongest, right? In defense, you can do something else, but this operation was so grandiosely offensive that indeed such a relatively inhibited leadership was surely a great pity, to say the least. Had Santa Cruz lived, or had Philip chosen, for example, Don Martin de Padilla, who was a more seasoned commander, the Spanish fleet might have pursued a bolder strategy. You understand, again, that there were more political reasons, like previous connections with the king, general support received by the other commanders for different reasons. But Padilla himself, for example, had led a squadron at the aforementioned Battle of Lepanto and built a distinguished naval career over the past decades, being thus a superior candidate in a strictly military sense, as demonstrated, by the way, by his successful command of the second and third armadas later on. As you know, that was a thing in 1596 and 1597. The English as well made counter expeditions to Spain, etc. That's something, if anything, we will not see in this series, but we can absolutely expand in other videos. This is, by the way, Martin de Padilla, not to be confused with Pedro de Padilla, that had followed, under the command of Santa Cruz at the 1583 Battle of Terceira. That was yet another, part of the aforementioned Azores expedition. In any case, and then this latter commander had been pretty good there. In any case, so Spain did not lack competent naval commanders, but again, this is not really how simply like the whole thing could be managed. Like in the moment of the expedition, yes, the military aspect was important, but in order to make Spain first of all, like, take off with this or sail for it better with this. You needed some greater political leverage, and Medina Sidonia had been chosen by Philip II, who was not much of a bad mind himself, regardless perhaps of his rigidity in particular. That had in fact been a double-edged sword during the same Armada campaign. Only Philip II could have properly thought in that instance to carry this out. He had chosen against Santa Cruz with the right insight and so on. You understand how things can go differently from different reasons. In 1588, Padilla was just the Captain General of Spain's galleys at that point, stationed in the Mediterranean to counter Ottoman naval threats, reflecting Philip's strategic prioritization of Mediterranean stability over the Armada's needs. We will talk at some point about the Spanish strategy in North Africa. We partially made videos, mostly, however, from the first half of the 16th century regarding Algiers, Tunis, how the Spanish organized this with Naples, etc. We're at the time of Charles V, right? Philip's father. So Philip's error in selecting Medina Sidonia was worsened by his appointment of Don Diego Flores de Valdez as chief of staff, so to say, who sailed with Medina Sidonia aboard the flagship Saint Martin. Flores de Valdez possessed 20 years of transoceanic experience, having commanded ships on the Spanish treasure routes, notably navigating the 1587 treasure fleet through hurricanes and English privateer attacks. So this was actually a qualified sea dog, but his expertise in long-range navigation, while critical, was accompanied by an abrasive and overbearing demeanor that alienated all the other squadron commanders of the Armada, creating internal strife during the expedition that definitely did not help. For example, his disputes with Juan Martinez de Recalde and Miguel de Oquendo, documented in letters where Recalde criticized Flores's overly cautious tactics, by the way, on that occasion, exacerbated tensions with the fleet's leadership. And so all these conflicts undermined the Armada's ability to adapt, change circumstances, just such as the English fleet's hit and run tactics that instead reflected exactly that level of flexibility that in particularly a much more pressured force really had been managed to develop in spite of all that stress. The Armada departing Lisbon on May the 9th, 1588, was organized into 10 squadrons reflecting Spain's complex naval hierarchy. The first squadron, under Medina Sidonia's direct command, consisted of 12 ships, 10 elite Royal Galleons of Portugal, each 600-800 tons, with up to 30 guns, built in Lisbon's royal shipyards with reinforced hulls to withstand Atlantic storms, and 2 Zabras, that is to say light shallow draft vessels of about 70 tons, sloop-rigged with oars and sails, carrying a few light cannons for scouting. These galleons were designed for durability with oak timber sourced from northern Spain. The second squadron, from the Bay of Biscay's coastal cities, comprised 10 galleons and 4 patache, that is a light craft between 50 and 100 tons, similar to Zabras, led by Juan Martinez de Recalde, himself Lepanto and Azores veteran who had commanded the Basque fleet against French corsair in 1580. So you understand that also these specific fields of action had been fundamentally the same. The third squadron included 14 first-class galleons of Castile, averaging 700 tons, and 2 patache nominally under Don Diego Flores de Valdez, who primarily advised Medina Sidonia on the Saint Martin. The fourth squadron from Andalusia consisted of 2 large armed merchantmen, 800 tons, 3 galleons, 5 armed hulks, that is to say merchant ships retrofitted with cannon platforms, and 1 patache led by Pedro de Valdez, cousin to Flores de Valdez, whose experience commanding Andalusian convoys bolstered his authority. The 5th, the Guipuzcoan squadron, included 9 large armed merchantmen, 1 armed hulk, and 2 patache, commanded by Miguel de Huendo, a Basque captain renowned for his aggressive leadership at the 1582 Azores campaign, where he personally led boarding actions. The 6th and final main battle squadron comprised 10 large merchant ships from the Levantine trade fleets, heavily armed to deter Turkish pirates led by Martin de Bertendon, who had fortified Levantine convoys against barbaric corsairs since the 70s of the 16th century. These were, as we've seen, there were 10 squadrons. These were sort of probably the battle one, the backbone. Then there were 4 auxiliary units completing the fleet. A 7th squadron under Juan Gomez de Medina with 23 supply hulks, known as Urcas, ranging from 200 to 800 tons for logistical support. An 8th squadron led by Don Antonio de Mendoza with 22 ocean-going light craft Zabras and Pataches for reconnaissance and communication. A 9th experimental squadron of 4 oar and sail galleasses, approximately 600 tons each, combining galley mobility with galleon firepower. These had been, ships pioneered, especially by the Italians, by Venice, that had naturally been absorbed by the Spanish Navy, given their the domination of important Italian assets and their Italian allies. This specific galleasses were, in fact, a Neapolitan design under Don Hugo de Moncada, aimed at dominating coastal engagements, in particular because they could unleash a hell of a firepower on the English coast. Then there was a squadron of 4 Portuguese galleys under Don Diego Medrano, suited for coastal operations but ill-equipped for Atlantic conditions. This is not really changing much. In any case, the galleasses were impressive, as they were armed with up to 50 guns each, but were hindered, if anything, by their reliance on oarsmen, requiring 200 rowers per ship. So I also made a video, again, about galley warfare. If you're interested in that, you can check sort of the various differences. But galley warfare, also in Northern Europe at some point, was really fitting, especially in specific operational circumstances. Before reaching the English Channel, 4 galleys and 1 galleon from the Biscay squadron turned back, unable to withstand the Atlantic's turbulent seas, as their low freeboards made them vulnerable to high waves, highlighting the galleys' unsuitability for open ocean warfare. So we're talking the smaller galleys. This reduced the Armada to approximately 123 ships, including 63 major armed sailing ones and 4 galleasses, totaling 67 combat units supported by 23 supply hulks and 33 swift, lightly armed Zabras and Patache. The fleet's strength lay in its 24 first-line warships that we documented, the 10 Portuguese Royal Galleons that were part of this broader naval tradition of the Lusitanian crown that had been first opening the age of explorations, but that eventually had needed to be propped up by Spain, that had also successfully taken it over, manipulated it, and also, in fact, not really subsidized the otherwise, potentially endowed Portuguese empire that instead sort of declined also relatively early altogether. There were these 10 great Spanish galleons of the so-called West India, so-called Indian Guard, and 4 Spanish galleons built for escorting American silver fleets. again, we've seen the English had been targeting in the Caribbean, each carrying up to 40 guns and designed for combat with reinforced hulls. You understand how much experimentalism was in it. I mean, how far we are from complete standardization or whatever. Of course, here it was about going with the good enough, which in many ways in warfare is the gold standard. The remaining 39 sailing warships were large merchantmen, adapted for battle, but less effective due to their commercial design and weaker structural integrity. We discussed how the idea of designing a ship for a specifically military purpose had been relatively new. It was there just from a very few generations. And so other ships were still being built in this fashion, refitted, readapted, like in this case. The galleasses proved underwhelming at the end of the day because their hybrid design struggled against the channel's strong tides, their oar-based propulsion, in spite of their impressive firepower. So, speaking of this, the Armada carried approximately 1,100 heavy guns, 4-pound shot or heavier, primarily short and medium-range culverins and demi-cannons, with a total broadside weight of about 600 tons optimized for boarding actions. The Spanish strategy relied on delivering a heavier broadside at close range, right? As long-range guns were limited to lighter shot to disable enemy ships for boarding. And this is instead, as you know, basically the opposite that the English practice. Even though we're really looking at the two forces, they were somehow balanced and similar. We will really see this better as the series unfolds. Just to make a comparison, though, in contrast, the English employed about 1,200 guns, mostly long-range culverins were ranged up to 1,400 meters to avoid boarding, right? Due to their smaller troop numbers, aiming to win through artillery duels at medium to long ranges. So basically, wearing out the Spanish, finding this attritional warfare where they were advantaged by range, that is not everything, naval engagements, especially at this time, but that can successfully, allow the English to stay a bit more repaired, still inflicting damage to the more cumbersome Spanish. And this is very interesting because when we have, this is nothing to do with naval warfare, but similarly, when the Dutch, the Swedes, in the later generations will have to cope with Spanish, with power, with imperials, and so the bigger guns, so to say, in broader terms of larger armies with thus sort of greater strategic effectiveness at the end of the day, because this is also what the thing was about. They would try to use sort of more tactically flexible solutions. And so not solutions that actually spoke of this sort of conventionally greater strategic force, right? It's something that could wear out the enemy through more sophisticated combined arms tactics, hit and run tactics, as we've seen here the English do themselves, which admittedly does not mean to be stronger, but can, if properly handled, if properly, again, commanded and organized, like carrying out sort of the task of balancing the odds further. The English race-built galleons with sleeker hulls and superior maneuverability enabled rapid repositioning, giving them, only in this sense, more like a maneuverability edge. Again, longer range guns that are not actually more smashing in the interest of probably destructive capacity. But again, if you combine, we've seen it in many other contexts in warfare. There's the heavier guy that punches harder. Of course, the enemy is going to tendentially avoid that. And again, it's not actually a matter of tactical superiority. All right, naval warfare will actually not evolve along that pattern. Like overall, we will see this better in other videos in coming series. Naval firepower is as consistent as the solid the entire fleet really is, right? So here the English adapt with something that can be sort of propagandated, would look, oh, this greater technology or greater flexibility, maneuverability. Yeah, but they were weaker. This is the point, all right? So this does not mean you can't win, and this is, in fact, quite the case. But never make the strategic mistake in this sense of simply buying the technologistic card, which is not even what this picture actually shows. Be aware instead of moral forces, right? Because most people basically juggle with these ideas because they want to back one side or the other, right? So you don't make a compliment to the English if you just said that they won mostly because they were resorting to these tactics. They won because they had a hell of leadership. They were incredibly motivated. They had a great vision of how the situation was unfolding, right? And also they had luck, because nobody can win without luck, especially in the bigger engagements. And in this sense, you can appreciate the major victory that for their country they managed to score, right? So when you look at the slight differences, such opposing strategies, tendencies, so to say, emphasize the critical role of each fleet's sailing capabilities and crew expertise. That the other element there, with the English leveraging their experience in privateering to outmaneuver the Spanish already in the previous years, as we've seen, with an important level of success, right? The Spanish had been more into sort of major engagements, as we've seen. The Azores campaign had been really very, very educational, so to say. They're fighting with the same, Iberian forces, the French ones, like it had been major engagement, and that's how it's very different from sort of commander raiding, infiltration, all this kind of stuff, that at some point the privateers at most against this sort of more regular forces. Speaking of crewsmen, that again, together with the admirals and the ships themselves, are key to the immediate performance. The Armada's manpower in 1588 was as crucial as its ships and guns, totaling roughly twice the English fleet's personnel, which we will also better observe in another chapter. The approximately 19,000 Spanish troops were of exceptional quality. These were the best soldiers of the era, organized into 5 brigade Cs tercios. I made a video about the tercio. The tercios were elite units of arquebusiers and pikemen equipped with light helmets and cuirasses, trained in the Spanish square formation, which combined firepower with defensive resilience. I also made a video about properly Spanish tactics versus the Dutch, the Swedish ones later on in, say, in a couple of generations, especially during the 30 Years' War. But the Dutch revolt, as you know, was already going on, which is also very interesting because Farnese, as we've seen, was governor of the Netherlands, and there was literally the 80 Years' War going on, while the Spanish imperial troops in the Netherlands were to back the Spanish invasion of England in all this. Then you had the Spanish have, of course, like their historical tradition in the Tercio, that was a volunteer unit. Was allegedly no disciplinary, say, standard, in the sense that whoever abandoned deserted the Tercio would have been just shamed socially and would have become an outcast anyhow. And we described what kind of troops there were. This was the invasion force, and it's understood, as a matter of fact, that if the English had failed at sea, allowing the Spanish to land the tercios in Britain, had it been just Scotland running down towards London, there would have really not been much of a match, so to say, right? Imagine, Philip II had been married to Mary Tudor. You know the whole story. There was a deep, we analyzed this in the previous visit, like a deep sense of not just of Spanish ambition, but of entitlement in all this, considering the weak English defenses. I recently also made a video about the Tudor army, and you know that, say, until the reign of Henry VIII, fundamentally, even sort of the more rudimentary longbowmen and billmen did work somehow together with, of course, more professional troops, mostly imported to England. But in Elizabethan times, the English reached possibly, like, aside from the early Stuart era, like probably the lowest military quality around, except for, of course, naval forces. And this is actually the point. Just think of how this power had sort of interiorized the importance of using not just the channel as a moat, but indeed the navy as the guys on the ramparts, like protecting the coast. So when you look at this contrast, it's all the more interesting, because after all, a slightly greater success of the Spanish at sea could have landed these formidable troops. Besides, as you know, there weren't just Spanish soldiers here. The tercios were manned by Italians, by Germans, etc. The Sicilian tercio under Don Diego Pimentel, the commanders were Spanish, but again, these troops were properly recruited as provincial forces from different lands. The Sicilian one marched overland to Lisbon in 1587 to evade Sir Francis Drake's raids. At that point, we documented them. This, as we've seen, had destroyed 24 ships and critical stores at Cadiz, disrupting Spanish supply lines and delaying preparations by months. So basically, the Sicilian tercio had to move from the Gibraltar Strait to Lisbon, rather than embarking and reaching the Portuguese capital by coastal navigation. Now, we can look briefly at the breakdown of the tercio's strength as the fleet departed Lisbon, right? So the tercio of Sicily, Pimentel, 2,500 men. The tercio of Flanders, commanded by Toledo, 2,700 men. The tercio of Naples, under Luzon, 2,900 men. The tercio of the Indian galleons, commanded by Isla, 2,400 men. The tercio of Don Agustin Mejia, 2,700 men, for a total of roughly 13,500, perhaps a bit less. So at least 3 tercios led by Pimentel, Don Francisco de Toledo, and Don Alonso de Luzon were commanded by Spain's finest officers, by the way. So had they landed, they knew really well what to do, given that they had all gained an extensive experience in Italy and the Netherlands. As you know, looking back in the day, there had been the Italian wars that had started in Italy, had witnessed the triumph of Spain over France, and together with the Empire, of course, the war had shifted mostly towards the Netherlands, where the Spanish now were coping with the Dutch revolt that had been not much an offspin, but definitely also a consequence of Spanish great power. It, as you know, had not just sort of started crushing the Dutch autonomies, but triggered, in fact, the English support to the same locals. And in fact, as we've seen in the previous videos, the bigger point, like of the conquest of England, was basically destroying the most, in the sense, critical Protestant power around, with England falling back into Catholic hands. Also in the same Catholic English lands, that would especially dissolved a coordinated Protestant front across Europe, and likely, in fact, reduced this heresy just to a fringe phenomenon without any major national adherence at that point. given the context, we made videos about the French wars of religion. We talked at this point, Protestantism was a bit at its peak, so the Spanish action was also felt to be more impelled. And you understand the spirit of the commanders here, also the one embarked. Like, these were the guys who, in a sense, had been fighting for that same Catholic order to be maintained with the empire. Made also videos about how the Austrian Habsburgs were coordinating with Spain throughout all of this. So it's a complex picture. Spain has the upper hand, but as you understand, and as it often happens historically, David beats Goliath, whose force is something that is more difficult to maintain in overall, right? When it is wielded, of course, it's massive. It has the strategic upper hand, but at the same time, it costs a lot, and so it must be equilibrially employed. Here, as you understand, the notion that the Spanish Armada's attempt at conquering England was doomed to fail is off the table. This was a very ambitious and risky campaign per se, but without these two qualities, like, you could have not done anything. Like, this was exactly what needed to be done if you wanted to knock out England of the game, of essentially anti-Catholic resistance. And what a success. At that point, also, France would have found itself in a pretty difficult situation as far as properly an imperial Habsburgic power in general was concerned. So it would have really changed, needless to say, a lot. And the people participating knew that. So imagine even all this military competence, both at sea and on land, coalesced, agglutinated to give properly the best at this point. The tercios that we described were overseen by Don Francisco de Bobadilla, a veteran officer with a rank equivalent to Major General, whose leadership in the 1580 conquest of Portugal and Italian campaigns was well documented. This force was bolstered by about 2,000 Portuguese infantry under Gaspar de Souza and Antonio Pereira, trained in Iberian warfare, and 32 companies of light infantry totaling almost 3,600 men, trained for skirmishing and rapid deployment to exploit enemy weaknesses. Things should have gone smoothly once landed, as we've seen, but if you look at the English Civil War, for example, we have observed how the shot would gain greater importance even before the continental developments that were a bit like the gold standard of military standards, also because of the Spanish. Due to the hedges of the English countryside, this doesn't mean, of course, the Spanish were simply, bringing these lighter troops for that sake. But in case things went different directions across Britain, like, there could be some important adaptability of the Spanish forces that, again, let's stress it, were condensating the greatest quality, experience, expertise, and so on. Staff officers, gentlemen, volunteers, and other personnel raised the total troop count to almost 19,000. That's how they arrived to that. So basically 13,000 tercios and other 6,000 half lighter forces, auxiliaries, and volunteers of some kind. On the other, remember that this expedition is heavily loaded with the aforementioned sense of confessional clash, a crusade to liberate the same England in the name of Rome, of the Catholic Empire, and just also other personal rivalries. But this is really, and we've seen it especially in the videos about, say, the same crusades were being more conventionally fought against Muslims in Mediterranean, but the ones against the heretics in the continent within Christians weren't less motivating in this sense. We're really continuing that tradition of the errant knight, as far as especially many dispossessed, smaller aristocrats of Europe, not having many other means to survive, would essentially join expeditions trying to seek fortune, adventure, but also some opportunity to be paid or looting, and so on. And this is how the world really worked at the time. This seemed such an enormous enterprise. It was a massive hype in Catholic propaganda and moral, preparation to this that is notorious, especially in the court of Philip II, with that essentially early Baroque kind of sense of imposance, but also of this whirlwind almost of chaos that men had to make sense of, the fracture of Christendom, the derecompaction of the same, especially under the Spanish guidance that came also aesthetically, visually, from this heavy, austere style, right? You look at the architecture of the Spanish, especially the Portuguese cathedrals. You have this incredibly austere, like cold, sometimes colder even than the Northern European Gothic. It is this sort of more, if not flamboyant, it's in certain, there's the flamboyant Gothic. There's a specific style, but let's say it was sort of richer in a way. Naturally, Protestants were stripping churches of everything in that sense, but architecturally speaking, you find this very old sense of the Reconquista, of knightly tradition, the spirit of the Hidalgos, as this probably at some point gentry rather than just nobility that had been fighting across the entire world at this point against the Moors in the past, then in Italy, in America, in the Netherlands, and now heading towards this other important enemy of Spain that had once been, look, Philip II was King of England in the time of Mary, and he had, in this sense, been stripped of his reign, and there was this early attrition between the Spanish and the English at the court. The English would have never tolerated him to be more like than a consort king rather than king himself. Right? So there is this atavic by this point, this old rivalry that is compounded by also the Protestant takeover and much more. But just for tasting the brutality of the times as well. Besides leading the entire land forces, so this formidable army, was Alonso de Leiva. This was a talented young officer who had commanded Philip's Sicilian galleys and recently served as Captain General of the Milanese cavalry, noted for his innovative tactics such as using cavalry to disrupt enemy lines during the 1586 Milan campaign. This was, again, we'll, if anything, talk about these kind of theaters, but there's a very famous El Greco portrait of Alfonso Martinez de Leiva that will not, as you know, come back to Spain. As a matter of fact, he will die in Ireland during the expedition. But that also shows a bit this interesting context where cavalry had somehow shrunk to a minimum, especially by the mid-16th century, with caracol tactics, mostly not to directly engage the pike squares, especially under arquebusier fire, etc. Even though cavalry had always maintained its shock effect, these sort of peppering enemy lines, disrupting the subsistence of the armies, was considered a skilled way to handle cavalry. And this young leader was aptly chosen by Philip II for the overall command, a huge responsibility at his age. This important army that especially would have had to basically take over English resistance once landed in Britain. The seamen, the final personal category in our account, were often criticized by English sources, such as Richard Hakluyt, for their inexperience compared to the English, who benefited from a robust maritime tradition bolstered by privateering ventures. Now, this judgment is relatively, like Richard Hakluyt was contemporary to the events, and therefore expressing this formed judgment in the moment, if anything. But the situation is somehow more complex. Now, many Spanish sailors were recruited from coastal regions like Andalusia, but lacked open sea experience just by themselves. Like this was objectively true. This was a weakness exacerbated by the fleet's rapid assembly under tight deadlines, with some crews trained for only weeks. Because they said, well, after all, these are sort of the cheapest elements to train, the quickest one at least. So we shouldn't be worried about that. It's much all about putting all the ships together, the guns, mostly establishing this massive logistical net across the Iberian Peninsula, the Netherlands, Italy, etc., to support this massive operation. And in fact, I think we should dedicate some videos about that. As a consequence, the average crewman was not that experienced. Approximately 20-25% of the troops were likely required to assist with sailing duties, as the 8,000 dedicated seamen could not manage the Armada's almost 60,000 tons of shipping alone, equating to basically an unsustainable over 7 tons per sailor. This reliance limited the Armada's ability to land its full 19,000 troops in England during naval engagements, with perhaps 14 to 15,000 available to reinforce the Duke of Parma's 30,000 strong invasion force in the Netherlands or land independently. This aspect is also very fascinating. Again, we will look at the role of Alexander Farnese better, because this 19,000 troops, of course, they couldn't land all together. Like even from the ships, they had to be partly maintained. So the idea of course, having the Dutch army landing in England to bolster the invasion, crushing any kind of opposition at that point, was one of the most important aspects of the expedition. We will see better how things unfolded during the campaign. Having said this, of course, there were, as we've seen, especially pretty good veterans, especially the same naval commanders, assisted by, again, all some cadres that, as relatively non-permanent at this point, were still, however, capable of sort of cowing all these crewmen and further training them during the expedition itself. So again, these weren't just some random people really thrown on board in absolute terms. However, of course, yes, the Spanish could have done better as far as this was concerned. We will never be able to measure how for example, how this factor specifically could weigh on the system. Like, we have to look at the broader picture and again realize that the Spanish went pretty darn close to win. The Armada's command structure was, as you have understood, intricate and problematic, contributing to operational inefficiencies. Medina Sidonia carried detailed secret strategic instructions from Philip II, who also mandated that he follow Diego Flores de Valdez's advice on fleet movements, tactics, and strategy. Philip II was a great centralizer. He wanted to control everything by himself. He was intelligent and he understood many of the challenges at hand. However, he couldn't obviously be there and simply, direct the operation by itself. So as we've seen, Medina Sidonia was so in command, and he was told by the same Philip, regardless of this rigid instructions, to still follow Diego Flores de Valdez's advice, with an unclear, again, burden on who eventually would have to take the most important decisions after all. this dual authority in the operation, so Sidonia and Flores de Valdez, led, as we explained, also not just because of the two, but others, to conflicts. In fact, Flores de Valdez's preference for a defensive crescent formation clashed with the same King Philip's orders for aggressive engagement, as seen in Medina Sidonia's dispatches. The latter guy who was in between the two, and also we will again understand what kind of implications this different deployments would have during the campaign. Flores de Valdez held two roles: commanding the 3rd Squadrons, as we've seen, so the galleons of Castile, that was quite an important one, and serving as a broader chief of staff of the operations, with the latter taking precedence. Juan Martinez de Recalde, the Biscayan squadron commander and fleet second in command, chose to sail with Medina Sidonia's 1st Squadron. It was with him the Royal Galleons of Portugal, rather than his own, right? Likely to influence strategic decisions with Medina Sidonia, causing further friction, as documented in Spanish naval logs. You have Alonso de Leiva, the army commander, as we just observed, that was also lieutenant general of the fleet, however, so he had his own saying in naval affairs as well, designated as such by Philip to assume overall command in the case Medina Sidonia had died during the expedition, superseding the status-conscious squadron commanders Recalde and Flores de Valdez, fueling rivalries that undermine cohesion. You can understand what a pot of snakes this could potentially, it would actually become. Despite these challenges, we should, however, because you point all the negatives out to when you look at the plan, because from their side, because not just the expedition was a Spanish defeat, and so these things will have, of course, had a burden. But because in general you tend to look at everything that is not optimal, and it is already a problem in the moment for the directly involved to know, right? As we will see now from the English side, also pretty serious things were going on. In any case, regardless of all these problems, there was an overall cohesion of purposes, of intents for the ultimate goal, so that the Great Armada that left Lisbon in early May 1588 was actually significantly improved during its final preparations. For example, Medina Sidonia and his staff implemented a rudimentary signaling system using flags and lanterns, essentially, of course, for maintaining the fleet's vast crescent formation, spanning over 2 miles, which had designed to protect supply ships. Just imagine trying to keep this together, and of course, there had to be a very strong communication, binding everything together. The Spanish also distributed detailed charts of England's southern coast, right? This in an age of, think about Mercator. This was actually later. There was already a better, and especially as far as coastal navigation, quite sort of precise information, geographical information available with atlases, etc. And just, Europeans were quite interconnected. By the way, the Spanish, especially in the Catalan part of the culture, had been quite advanced in cartography since the Middle Ages. The Portuguese themselves had expanded further. So, of course, Spain, as the greatest power in Europe, even though it wasn't, let's say, it was a great naval power, it wasn't turning to be the single most refined naval power, but it could definitely supply all the sort of level of intelligence, of information, of documentation necessary for this gigantic enterprise, right? Specifically, Spanish intelligence regarding England's southern coast was available from, again, also quite some time. Spies, of course, were present everywhere, but there were also captured English pilots that turned out to be quite useful in detailing such information, having gone sort of back and forth along the coast. As you know, like the Armada would end up circumnavigating the entire British archipelago, but of course if things were to happen in an optimal way, there was also the Scottish plan, simply landing in Scotland, that would have provided the Spanish with sort of greater support for all the operations available. But again, the optimal thing was landing, of course, in the south, taking over London also with the army of Farnese, and that would have been really, really smooth. Besides, we've seen how in Farnese's plans there were literally the theories regarding the feasibility of some surprise attack with literally like flat bottom boats from just given the proximity of the Netherlands with Britain, and in some ways that could have been attempted, but how the expedition unfolded was really the reason why so many problems arose, and as you could obviously just foresee for an operation of this formidable difficulty and size. There were also assigned experienced navigators that, of course, had to recognize the features of the English coast to determine the exact position of the Armada. There were some with treasure fleet experience as well, distributed, by the way, among each squadron to navigate the channel's strong tides and shifting sandbanks, right? So everything had to be as smooth as possible. All these precautions were also entrusted to the leaders of the various squadrons and down the line in the way it should have been done. These preparations included stockpiling, of course, 180,000 pounds of biscuits and 11,000 barrels of wine, though spoilage remained a concern. In fact, there was some initial delay connected with this. In fact, at sea, the Armada faced, first of all, weeks of delay due to contrary winds and a major storm off Cape Finisterre, which scattered the fleet itself. Pretty heavy testing already at this stage. It damaged several ships, including the Santa Ana, which lost its main mast. Right. Additional time was spent in La Coruña to replenish water and replace spoiled rations. That, of course, are the biggest concern. Think about all the parasites, the mice, and so on. Critical for the fleet's total of, as we've seen, 27,000 personnel, as nearly 1/5 of provisions had already deteriorated. The final leg began on July the 22nd with the Armada sighting, quote-unquote, the lizard that was Cornwall's southernmost point. We are on July the 29th, marking the start of the Channel campaign. That's why also we will pass in the next episode to the English side of the story, because we are there practically. And again, I'm glad to cover this Armada campaign step by step. I know some of you may seem, I can say boring, but I bet these are the videos that do not get too many views after all. I don't know why that is the case, or either I think there are so many videos about the Armada, and or at least a prevalently Anglo-American audience will know about this stuff to an important degree, or maybe it's just like the period, like Renaissance warfare. Somehow I see here not so much calling like, I don't know, migration era warfare for some reason. But I think the 16th century is the big underrated. I would argue that there is probably also, I would have probably, had it been a modernist, probably would have specialized in the 17th century, but I was heavily influenced family-wise in terms of regarding properly 16th century history, especially Habsburgic one, but also I like very much Elizabeth for that matter. I like the same say the Spanish as well as the Imperial Habsburgic lines at this point were, as we've seen also in different videos already, two different things really. So I'm glad because we're getting where I would have liked Schwerpunkt to go from a very long time ago. I remember when it was the pandemic, it was sort of the golden age of YouTube apparently, because everybody was home watching this stuff. To this day, I have made 85, this is the 85th video about 16th century history, which is mostly about warfare. And that I think we're going to soon expand with ever more sort of in-depth, pertinent stuff. We have, again, to glue all this content together also through a more sort of basic history content, probably not just the military one. But I'm satisfied with what we have been doing, because it turns out it's maybe not a particularly, in fact, watched playlist. Let me check. But something that surely has very good content. I think that since the beginning of Schwerpunkt, we covered, even though, especially at the beginning, with something more general, but also looking actually at, well, not so many views, at, for example, the single Renaissance armies, in ways that surely attracted attention. You see here the views are rarely, well, I can't say rarely booming, but they're always consistent, right? You rarely find sort of lagging behind content, if not from the very previous years. And so this is, I think, quite important, because it does witness the presence of a general interest for modern warfare that somehow was always, again, in the radar of Schwerpunkt, in the horizons of Schwerpunkt from an early age, so to say. I think we must expand also, and probably on modern English warfare, British warfare in general as well. And this is the 19th video on that, so it's not like we did completely nothing or too few, right? Overall, however, there is more and more to make, right? My channel is mostly appreciated because it somehow carries a continental historical perspective that is felt to be missing, especially on big sort of YouTube history channels in general. And that whenever is covered by authors that want, maybe from the same Anglo-American background, let's sort of expand on this territory. It's done unavoidably from that specific perspective in some other ways. So obviously, you still haven't sorted out in general where I come from, which is very funny to me, telling the truth. But it's I'm definitely a carrier of such mentality, and I would argue that you can't really understand Western history if you don't blend both ways. Like you should be careful not to get into the sort of the more pop sort of disclosing aspect that is largely dominated in narrative and in rhetoric by the Anglo-American perspective, which is, again, totally fine. When I say this, I'm not really criticizing the actual information. On the contrary, I grew up, in a sense, from a military historical point of view, largely through such, if not publications, however, that kind of temper. However, when it gets just like too self-referential, too much running in circles, because it ends up always talking about that northwestern European perspective and mostly that a colonial dimension, to the point that you hear more about, I don't know, non-European, non-Western countries just because they were colonized, say, by the British, then same European countries. Well, at that point, in major European countries, at that point, you know that there is something that doesn't work. And admittedly, okay, that there is a lot out there, especially on YouTube, so I'm not making the case that we are here knowing, say, doing who knows what, but you do realize, I mean, we do a lot, actually. We do very good stuff in that sense. But this is exactly what I want to say, that if you if you just buy books, and you will find this information, you will be able, of course, to gather a bit that same sense of how it was. And there are many perspectives. For example, last year I encountered some, like the English traditional perspective, Catholic English perspective. That's very interesting, telling the truth, and it's unusual, and it should be recovered in a way, and not just. And it would be interesting to make a mix of that with my continental perspective on that matter. But if we have really to cover a lot, it's important to cover, I don't know, Poland, Sweden, Eastern Europe, the Italian states. Here, we haven't really made too much Iberian history as well, and that's a bit criminal. Here, let me check how much Spanish, especially, and how much there are the German states. There is France. France is yet the other. France, some of you have asked. Here we have just modern Spanish warfare. This is just the 9th video, I think. They are too few. Excuse me, I drink a little. There is no doubt that we can do better. The playlist didn't earn too many views, but that's also because, in fact, it's a small playlist to an extent, I want to think. So I don't really know how you are receiving this, how, let's say, because with Modern Warfare, we've mostly gone with military stuff. So we haven't really explored more than much beyond that. It's surely important, again, to add, I don't know, I should perhaps increase the frequency of that basic sort of modern and contemporary history, because otherwise it will be really too infrequent. We have something else, but just for certain polities or for certain specials, and it mostly revolves around war. But again, I'll have to sort out something, especially as some cycles, branches are naturally going to be exhausted at some point. But you tell me, right? Because the last Armada video, if I'm not wrong, it was from last autumn. It didn't make so many views, 600. And at the time, I had, generally speaking, more views than I have now. So I remember it wasn't much of a success. Also, the first one. Our first one was almost 2 years ago. It did somehow better. Just 2? We made, just 2. Or no, we made surely more. Because this is the Spanish. Yeah, this is the Spanish. Well, whatever. So, just for the sake of curiosity. But having been making more Tudor stuff recently. For example, the last video about the Tudor army organization didn't receive so few views in a time of relative let's say. Also, the one of English infantry of Tudor era wasn't really that bad. And so, again, there is margin for this, but you tell me. Like, I'm interested in your opinion, what you want to hear, what you don't want to hear, etc. Again, of course, I'm going to make my own content the way I do, but I try to sense through the engagement, what kind of content do you actually prefer, do you want to see or not? Because I will try to equilibrate. You see, we have so much here that while not stopping making the same topics, I will modulate their frequency in a slightly different way. So I presume that this is going to really help. And I am really, again, open even to suggestions to other topics or whatever, but I really care in general, and I think that we're doing our our job. We should talk much more about continental, for example, battles. I don't know, the Battle of Mulhdorf or something like, I don't know, the Battle of Bicocca or the Battle of Saint-Quentin. Like, these are some big 16th century battles. There are many others, of course, but just for the sake of example, it's an incredibly bloody century for that matter. So such episodes do not really exhaust themselves. We really shall make more about 16th century France, in my opinion. For today, I would say, however, that I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.